Here she comes.
Where have we lost? Was it Deborah? Normally sits over there.
No, Deborah's not part of the committee. The grant represents Springwood. Now mai, haere mai, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome, committee members and those watching further afield to the meeting of the Representation Review Committee, Subcommittee. I'll call on Councillor Epiha to lead us in the karakia.
Tēnā tātou, tēnā koe Mark, karakia te matanga, tūtawa mai runga, tūtawa mai raro, tūtawa mai roto, tūtawa mai waho. Kui tauwai te Māori tū, te Māori ora ki te katoa, haumie, huie, tai,
Oie.
kia ora.
Kia ora. Now, members, we have no apologies. The committee is here in full. Conflicts of interest? None. Confirmation of the minutes. Someone would like to move? Move Councillor Epiha, seconded the Mayor. Well, you probably can't, therefore, second them. Councillor Gallagher. Well, I'm informed you could have seconded them, but it's better this minute. Is there any discussion on those minutes? If not, move that they be confirmed. All those in favour? Aye. Contrary, carried. Chairperson's verbal report. I hope that our goal for today is that we will bring forward a small number of scenarios for the pre-consultation that will address, that will consider communities of interest in those scenarios, and that the issue of community boards will be considered later in the meeting. Ideally, I think the number around 3, perhaps 4 at the most scenarios would be best. Any more than that, I don't think we're doing our job well enough. We had a workshop. Mr. Hill and I went to the Melbourne Community Board and had a very helpful workshop, and I thank the Community Board for that. And Mr. Orton, if you can take the thanks back to the Community Board, it was very helpful. Particularly, I found when they reminded us that prior to the 1989 council amalgamations, Springs and Ellesmere had in fact been a Springs county. So there is in fact some precedent for those areas having been joined. I do have a complaint, members. After our last meeting, we agreed on a small number of maps to be brought forward. One of our members went direct to staff and asked for modifications to another map and that it could be brought forward to the meeting. It has been brought forward, but that's not how a committee should work. All requests for work should be directed to me as chair and from me to Mr. Ward to get staff to do this work. To go direct to staff is in fact improper and unhelpful. So I would ask that that cease. If you want modifications to map or other work done, bring it to me or Mr. Ward. And David, I'd ask you to ask staff, if they get a direct request, to refer it back to you or myself for consideration.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair. Could I?
No. I don't particularly need the member to identify themselves. Just let it be known that that's not the normal procedure of a committee and it's not helpful. So don't do it again, please, people. This is the second time it's happened and I let the first one slide. I perhaps should not have. So it would just be helpful if we can focus on the maps that the committee had agreed to at its last meeting, but we have the additional map in our list of things to consider.
Well, Mr. Chair, rather than every member of this committee feeling like they're under suspicion, the member is me, and during the work that I do as mayor and working with our staff, and I wasn't at the last meeting, but seeing through the minutes, I had a chat with our staff and requested that a slight modification be made, as my role I think entitles me to be able to have those types of discussions, and I'm sorry that it wasn't done through this meeting, but I would hate anyone to think that it was another member of this committee and have aspersions thrown across everyone else. I'm sorry that it didn't come through you, Mr. Chair, but that's
Yeah,
the source of the request.
Thank you for identifying yourself, Sam. But it's just the procedure on any committee is that the request for work should go through the chair, which in council is you, and a subcommittee may not be you. And it does help the flow of work to be better addressed if it comes through the chair and or the committee. So we'll move on from that. We have the notes from the community board workshop briefing. Is there any discussion on those?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, were we invited as a committee to that briefing? Because I wasn't aware that I was supposed to be there. If I wasn't, an apology.
No. It was just the chair and Stephen, Mr. Hill and I went to just a brief knowledge of where we were at on the models that we looked at. It wasn't a full committee taking it to them.
It wasn't a feedback session from the community board to the committee.
No, well, it was a discussion where we were at. They did give some feedback that the notes reflect, but it wasn't a full-blown committee workshop with the Melbourne Community Board.
Cheers. Look, on behalf of the community board, thank you to you and Steve for coming. It enabled the board members all to be brought up to speed, to understand the process. Now I can't get rid of that one. And so we appreciate that. It was really just an informational exchange as much as anything. So thank you.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to ask if the amendments were adopted and what those amendments were, and just seek clarification on the amendments that were that you spoke about in the first instance.
We have a map, an additional map,
Yes.
in our to be discussed later on today, above the 3 that we agreed at the last meeting to bring forward. So we'll get to that.
Thank you.
Would someone like to move that we receive the report? All those in favour? And I've missed one. I should have moved that. I'll move that we receive my verbal report. Those in favour? Contrary carried. And we move on to the representation review scenarios. Oh, okay.
Sorry, I just got a wee bit lost there. We've moved through that. So the Melbourne Community Board representation rebriefing, that was just happening. It was just spoken to, was it?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. We just had a question, or more possibly a statement around the 7.1 Appendix A. And it's no reflection on the community board, but more reflection on the committee and a council, I guess. And it's around, what is it, page 13 on diligent, preliminary consultation and engagement. And I've, through my journey on this committee, I've stuttered out amongst the words regarding consultation and consultation with all of our constituents, and the responsibility to do so underneath Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the Local Government Act through legislation. It is my opinion that we, as a committee, have failed under our obligation of the treaty to actually uphold the negotiation process and also the consultation process. Where in this document here, it says we've had discussions with Te Taumatururanga mai te ngai tua hudiriruranga. I acknowledge mana whenua. However, there is another portion, and we've been through that discussion over and over again, that we haven't consulted with. I'm not reflected in these documents. I haven't been consulted in this process on the corridor of Māori wards. So I want our minutes to actually reflect that, so that when councillors and council come to this corridor again in the next 6 years, that is clearly stated, and it should be something taken into account of.
Kia ora, Shane. I believe that's something that is an ongoing discussion at a different place as to how the council to address the consultation with other Māori in our district, if I phrase it like that. It's a journey we are on, and I thank you for raising it. And as you've noted, it's a decision we've made, but it's a discussion that we'll keep in front of us for the future.
And it's also a decision that I've made too, Mark. So I'm not pointing fingers here. It's a decision and a journey that I'm on as well, and we're taking together. So let us reflect on that in the next 6 years. Thank you.
Sure. Right, so we get back to tab 8, page 23 on the electronic copy of the agenda. Representation review scenarios 4B and 3SE9. Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll get Murray to take you through the detailed working on these scenarios. And really, as has been mentioned at our meeting last month, the subcommittee gave staff guidance as to further refinement of the options that we were considering at that time, and particularly around the scenarios 410B and 3SE9. Some changes were proposed. So I'll get Murray just to talk us through that process and findings from that work.
Thank you, Stephen. Let's recycle this up on the screen. Yeah.
Therese.
Thank you, Stephen. When we talked last time, we looked at some maps, 410B, 47B, and 3SE10C. You also asked us to look at that 410B and see whether some modifications could actually occur. And so what we've done is looked at that. The three options that you asked us to consider was whether the mesh block, which was an Ellesmere ward right at the top, third at the top, could be moved into Melbourne ward. You asked us to consider the township of Springston, whether it can move from Ellesmere ward to Springs, and also asked us to look at the three mesh blocks between Burnham and Rolleston to see whether that would actually work. Individually, each one of those does work. The option 1, which was the mesh block at the top, I think the map there now, is this mesh block right up in here that we talked about. We've modelled that there as a the right one, the wrong way around. Right, I'll go down here. Apologies. 410C, we refer to it as, and that's it sitting in here. That does actually work on its own. Kingston itself also works right down in here, but we haven't got that wee bit at the top sitting there. So what we have is option 1 and option 3 actually do work together, but the Springston one doesn't work with the others. So when we've looked at that, we thought, is there a chance of putting that together? And so in this option here, 410E, and I accept there are other options as well, we've looked at that option 1, which is that mesh block I'm just highlighting there, and that wee bit down here around Burnham actually works around there in that 410E. So that's what you're asking us to do, and so it's a matter of how that works with how you see it, and do you wish to take any of those out to pre-consultation, or are you still comfortable with the 410B that you had as part of the meeting?
Just to be clear, that the outcome is that to meet the plus or minus 10% rule, the two options that Murray's outlined can work, but all three of those options would not meet the plus or minus 10% requirement.
Any feedback from members on maps for 10C, D and E? John.
So just so I'm clear, I should be looking at 4-10B, 4-10C, 4-10E.
Yes.
Those are three that I've got lined up along the center.
That's
B
right.
was the original one that we went away from the last meeting, and C and E variations where you've taken a piece off the tongue of the Ellesmere ward and pulled it down. I'm just trying to see the difference between C and E. Yes.
And what is also got is that
Oh, yes.
three mesh blocks have been drawn as well.
into
Central.
Central. Okay.
So those two actually work together.
Yep.
Whereas when you're looking at Springston on its own, that can work on its own, but you can't bring in the wee bit at the top, nor can you bring in the Burnham to Rolleston part. So, so I took the option of 410E of just amalgamating option 1 and option 3.
So through you, Mr. Chair, and I was quite keen to get that little bit of tongue knocked off, and that's been so from my point of view, but to the rest of the group, where is the negative in C or E?
It's would be, in my view, 14E has Springston in the Ellesmere ward,
Right.
and I would be concerned that the community of interest for Springston is not the Ellesmere ward, and 14C has the mesh blocks essentially between Rolleston and Burnham, or Rolleston and Burnham, Orfrey Road, in the Ellesmere ward, and those 3 mesh blocks don't associate themselves with Ellesmere either. So, and I also have a concern around community of interest for all of the 14 models. They all have West Melton and the mesh blocks around West Melton in the Malvern ward, and that whilst that may be historically that West Melton had an association with Malvern, I think that most newer residents in West Melton would associate themselves with the Selwyn Central ward and Rolleston rather than the Malvern ward and Darfield. So it's around community of interest is where I was concerned, and I thought the committee was looking at the changes to 14B was trying to address communities of interest. And thank you to Murray and Stephen. It shows that we can address some of them, but not all of them at any one time in any of the 14 models. Councillor Miller, would you have a comment on where you think Springston would more naturally lie?
I think that's the guts of the matter here in front of us today, is either Springston's in or out. It's a straightforward question. My historic preference has been that given its location next to Lincoln, that Springston was in Springs Ward. You've got Cycleway, you've got the university, you've got the local schooling. Basically it's right at the peripheral edge of Ellesmere Ward, so it's right at the very far end. It's a tipping point, isn't it? And so really to move it out is only just a population exercise. It's a mesh block exercise to make Ellesmere work, isn't it, really? Probably, as Mark says, communities of interest, probably Springston would regard itself as a Springs Ward. So in that case, if you take that point of view, 410D is the only one that works.
And the same argument, Grant, is for those mesh blocks between Burnham and Rolleston, that they don't have any affinity. They don't shop, they don't play sport in Leaston either. They don't go to school.
I think that's the challenge for us as a committee, Mr. Chairman, is that we're never going to please all people
That's
all
right.
the time. And the reality is, when people pick up the phone to ring their councillor, as you often describe, they pick up the person that probably is going to help them, and whether it's an Ellesmere councillor or whether it happens to be a Springs Ward councillor, it's probably not going to make any difference to the ratepayer. It's just an election process.
Yeah, the difference would be when we come to address community board models, that if West Melton is in Malvern, it has an impact on the Malvern Community Board membership.
Yeah. I think we've already decided that to make it's not a feasible option to have West Melton and Rolleston together. The population just doesn't work, so we have to just accept that, I think.
In a 4-ward model.
Well, in this 410B.
Yeah, in any of the 14 models, yes. So, is there any other discussion around the 14 models?
The only other thing I'd say to Grant is I agree with everything he said, but at least the elected member probably be going through Springston on a regular pattern as they come to Rolleston or travel about, aren't they? So
I'm only putting the point of view, it's the committee to decide, not my personal vision.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
Right. Well, we're not agreeing. This is the discussion at this stage. We'll come to that perhaps a little bit later. Sam, you have?
Yeah, I just think each of the 14 models compromises something that for each ward is a bit of a deal breaker, and it's not like major stuff, but when put together, there's like lots of compromises that were coming together to try and stick with a 4-ward model. And I think that there's, when we look at the 3-ward models, it simplifies a whole lot of the bits that we're trying to argue around the periphery about. So I think Springston more naturally sits in Springs Ward. I think that the top end of what is existing Ellesmere sits more naturally in the Melbourne Ward, and the pieces between around the edge of future growth for Ralston sit better in the Selwyn Central Ward, and none of those three can all be dealt with together in a 4-ward model. So I don't really support any of the 4-ward models going forward. If you're asking us to pick one, then we'll need to go through that process, because I don't think there's a clear winner.
Okay. Any other discussion around the 410 models?
I think the positive, well, probably the positive is that at least Te Wahura is in 1 ward. Previously it was split into 2. Although some historical context is that the Springs Ward have had a close affinity with the lake and its lake settlers, and so that will be lost under this model.
Right. Okay. Well, we're not. We have. I think we'll. Yeah, we could. I mean, the decision today would. At some point we have to decide if we do take a 410 model through, and if we do, which of them it would be. So I'm just not sure whether we perhaps have a look at the other model, the 3.9 models, and then come back to trying to settle on, or even carry on and have a discussion around the community boards before we come back to settle on maps scenarios to take forward, because they also have an impact on the models we want to take forward. So
can I assist by suggesting we recommend 14D, which includes Springston, and see where it fails, because we've discussed the models. Maybe to put it forward, because it seems from community of interest wise that would be the best of the 4 ward models. 14D.
Oh, if I agree with that too.
Yeah.
okay, it would seem that if we were to take a 14 through, it would be 14D. Do you want
Formal motion or just?
Oh, well, we'll note that for now. I think we'll come back to it later in the meeting when we come to look at what we are bringing forward. So we then look at the next models with the 3 SE9 models, Stephen and Murray.
Thank you. The 3 SE9, as noted in my report, was an option at the time of the last meeting. It wasn't favoured necessarily by the committee. It is a 3-ward 9 council option, with Ellesmere and Springs being combined. What we're asked to do was to look at moving West Melton to the Melbourne ward and shifting the boundary between Ellesmere and Melbourne to north of Dunsandel. And so I'll just scroll down to that one to show you how that looks. We've probably got the map sitting in front of you now. You need to do this, but this is how this one actually now looks. The 3 SE9C. So it's basically just moving up the line. There's a few adjustments made around in here to make this one work a bit better, to get with obviously within the plus or minus 10%.
Yeah.
Don't you
John,
think that one?
hang on a minute. I think
Sorry.
Sam probably hit his
Yeah, go
microphone
on.
first.
Hi. So this is the one that I requested. I think that the boundaries, when we've discussed around the 3-ward model, Springs Ellesmere coming together seemed to make sense. But the model that was presented to us included a whole lot of Ellesmere moving into Melbourne, which I didn't think made sense originally. So moving the Ellesmere wards to a greater size to include at least the Dunsandel Township and getting back to State Highway 1 is the approximate boundary of the change. And I'm just not sure whether there's a 40 population piece, MB272 for 700, a thin slither, which I'm not sure where the State Highway 1 actually runs there, but 40 population is not going to make a difference either way. But I think just think it's cleaner having a clear line, and moving West Melton into Melbourne, which matched the 410 models that we've been talking about. And again, while there's some connection currently with Ralston. There's a lot of historical connection into Melbourne, and means that we can maintain 2 councillors as a minimum within the ward. Gives us a 9 councillor option. That to me, the boundaries matched communities of interest a whole lot more, rather than the previous 9 model didn't. So that's hence why I asked this to be brought forward for consideration as a 3 wards, 9 councillor model.
John.
Good point, Sam. I kind of like this scenario, and you could be, I was going to use the word devious, but it's not devious. You could argue that the 2 councillors who are going to represent the Melbourne ward are obviously now going to represent West Melton, and by the nature of that, they will be pulled more into an urban type relationship, or more closer to the scene, and in that case would give them a better knowledge or a better engagement with a wider community. I don't know how important that is, but I think it works. It's all compromise, and bearing in mind we're putting forward proposals for we're comfortable with, which the community can make comments on, and I think it works. So we would there, I believe, put it out there, explain, and let's see what the community thinks.
Grant, you have mics on. Do you have a comment?
Not deliberately, I'm sorry, I didn't turn it off, but well, I've got the floor. I mean, it does concern me, I suppose, that we are, when you look to the future around the NPS urban development housing, which is in front of us, what these wards might look like at the next representation review. Are we actually allowing for the future? And they are big wards, geographically huge wards, Kaya to Waimak in some respects. So it'll be depending on what the workload is, and how you can represent your community, whether it's at the bus stops and Burm's model, or whether it's strategic level stuff.
Yes. I've considered that, and I came to the conclusion that given the growth that we expect to have in the eastern part of the district, whichever model is chosen will not be sustainable. It will not be the model that will go past the next representation review, because the substantial growth in the east will mean whichever model we choose. Therefore, in some ways, it simplifies our problem, is that we have to focus less on what's sustainable past 6 years, because none of these will be. I have a concern about 3 SE9C is that we've solved one problem by creating another. As I've said, even though Malvern has a historical link to West Melton, most of the new residents, those who've moved in the last 10 years, do not. They've been in the Selwyn Central ward. They either associate with the western part of Christchurch or Ralston, and we've solved a problem around Dunsandel being in the Malvern ward by putting West Melton in the Malvern ward, and I think that's just merely shifted the problem. And when you compare it to 3 SE10, which is a very similar map to 3 SE9, 3 SE10C, you actually have West Melton and the areas to the northwest and west of West Melton in the Selwyn Central ward, and I think that actually looks, in my view, as a committee member, 3 SE10C looks a better map than the 9 model. That said, if we decided to take both SE9C and SE10C up for consultation, I'd be happy with that, because I think they give our communities a choice. If the makeup of the Malvern Community Board would be considerably different if there was a community board that for SE9C, because with the population in West Melton, it would mean either a larger board or a different, it would mean a new division for election of members in the ward.
Subdivisions.
New subdivision, which would be sort of the West Melton piece would have to create a new subdivision and possibly 2 more members of the board. But that's a discussion we'll make in a few minutes. So I can see what problem it solved. I believe it created another problem, and compared to SE10C, I think SE10C is the better map. But if we were to bring it forward, I think it's a choice for the community. It's a choice for the committee to consider which of these maps we bring forward, and whether we bring both 10 and 9 councillors in the 3-ward model, or one, or both, to the committee. Jenny, did you have any comment on this map?
I can see fors and against for both. I mean, I can see where you're coming from, putting West Melton into Selwyn Central. Yeah, I think with the pick you'd have to put in 10C, but then, as you said, 9C is giving the public another option to look at. So, yeah.
One of the other pieces around wanting consideration of 9C was to give options for the public to give us feedback on councillor numbers as well. So the options that we had before included 10s, and this one included a 9 using a similar map. So that will be another piece of feedback that we're going to receive through the process.
Mr. Chair, I think if you're going to go for a 3 model, come back and reflect on the comments that Grant made before, and that is, where is the growth pattern likely to be over the next 6 years? Because is whatever model is proposed to go forward going to potentially be sustainable beyond that period, or are we just setting up for a temporary solution that's going to have to be reviewed further down the track?
Grant, do you have a further comment?
I was really just going to reiterate what the CEO said. I think the future holds Rolleston boundary being bought in tighter. And to set West Melton up now for the future is probably although it might not immediately seem obvious, it seems like to future-proof it a bit, that actually West Melton does become part of Melbourne or a riding of a future subdivision of Rolleston. So it makes more, I hear what you're saying, Mr. Chair, but it does seem to be more future-focused.
Well, the reality is also there's no guarantee that the Selwyn as a district will exist in 6 years' time, given the direction of our current government. We may be the Selwyn ward of an enlarged Greater Christchurch Council.
Big Mr. Chairman, they could be a suburb of ours.
I like it.
Yeah, don't point the mayor that way. That's what happened with the merger of Banks Peninsula and Christchurch. So are there any further comments on that map? John?
I think as a group, look, I don't discount the future, and I don't discount trying to have an eye on that. But if you do focus too much on the future, it does tend to influence you as to what you're going to meet today. Now, if we had been sitting here 6 years ago in St Myers, we had no idea of what the district was going to develop like then. We never saw the extra proposed subdivision in Rolleston and Lincoln. It's virtually come out of the blue, and there will be others that come out of the blue. I encourage the group, well, not to forget that. I think we should focus on the here and now and deal with what you think is going to go forward for a short period, because you might go back to a completely whole new blueprint. And look, we've seen from the research we've done, people really are not that knowledgeable on wards anyway. They're pretty grey. They relate themselves more to townships, don't they, or that sort of thing. So I don't think we need to get too stressed. And in 6 years' time, at least to know we can change again. But the more things we try to think, we end up by compromising and get nothing, in my view.
Yeah.
So I'm in favour of fronting up to the here and now, which really works, and we'll get you through the next election anyway.
Or two. Yeah, as I chaired this committee 6 years ago, we actually chose a model 6 years ago that was closest to the status quo, knowing that at this triennium we would have to have something different because the status quo wouldn't be sustainable beyond that period. And I think it's almost the same choice that faces us today. We can choose whatever model we choose. We know is not going to work. You know, with 4,000 sections in planning around Rolleston, that would mean potentially 8,000 more electors over the next possibly 5-10 years. I'm not quite sure of the time frame, and that means that that's Rolleston could end up being half the population of the district. and that will challenge any representation review in the future. So I agree with you, John. I think we need to focus on the best model for today and not quite focusing on one that's going to do past the next representation review, because that will be different. Sam?
Yeah, to support those comments, we're here to focus on 2022 and 2025, not 2028, and the future council can make those decisions going forward. So keep it in the back of our minds, but really we're focusing on the next 6 years as the immediate front of mind focus. With the comments, John and Mark.
Okay, well, members, we haven't discussed the other model that we brought forward from the last time because it's been unchanged, but are we ready to suggest, if I'm hearing the committee right, that we could take forward 14D, 3 SE 10C, 3 SE 9C, and 4 7B as offering the widest range of choices to our community? 14D, 3 SE 10C, 3 SE 9C, and 4 7B. The reason I include 4 7B in that list is it actually goes with what you said before, Sam, offering our community the widest range of choices, because potentially 4 7B, with if it were to have community boards, and that's a discussion we get to, there's quite a different model for our representation, but one that could work. So again, it would offer our community a range from close to status quo to something a bit different, and allow our community to come back to us and tell you, no, we don't like that model at all, get thrown away, or hey, let's try something different for the next 6 years. So how do members feel?
Can I just, Mr. Chairman, if I may, just to recap on that. If you recall from the last meeting, we said we would bring forward 410B, 47B, and 3 SE10C. So we have effectively substituted 410D for 14B. 47B remains in the mix, and 3 SE10 we have now substituted 3 SE9, or we've added 3 SE9C to that.
Yeah.
So we're effectively bringing the three options that we had identified last time, one with a modification, and added another 3 ward model.
Yeah, I think if I've heard the committee correctly, that there was support for SE9C. I haven't actually tested whether there's still support for SE10C, but it was a model that, along with 47B, was the 2 other models that were brought forward from the last meeting. Members, you still got your mic on, Sam?
Yeah, I don't think that taking 47B forward is the right option for us as a committee. Maybe it's just to test the community in the pre-consultation, but I think what we're going to do is risk diverting what the major things we want talked about with some concerns around councillor numbers. It's an outlier for where we're going, and we'll suck up a whole lot of the oxygen in the conversation. And I don't think that we're quite ready as a community to have a conversation about instituting 4 community boards or 3 community boards for each ward. Because again, that's another level of complexity that I just think trying to take our community through, and the time frame that we've got will dilute actually the big discussion that we need to have around what is the ward structure and councillor numbers. So I've really appreciated the conversation that we've had around 47B. I've liked it up till now, and having it as part of the conversation. I just wonder about the wisdom of going out to our community with it. As far as an outcome, I'm quite comfortable with it. I just think we want to be cautious and careful with the messaging that goes forward from this committee, as people will read headlines and react to the greatest changes rather than necessarily be engaged in some of the more nuanced work that we're doing around border changes. So I don't hate it. I just think as a committee, let's be careful with what we put forward and not overcomplicate messaging.
Okay. Oh, was I next? I think.
Well, John's had a fair bit to say.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I've taken everybody's discussion today. I'm in favour of a 3 ward option, and based on the figures that I have in front of me in terms of growth, I've got Ellesmere ward over the last 6 years, 14 to 20 with 29, Springs ward with 30, Selwyn Central with 58, and Melbourne ward with 10%. So if we're adding Springs and Ellesmere together, that's on par with the South and Central Ward, at 60% growth each, and 10% of the Melbourne Ward. We need to be aware of that. So where do they gain the best option in terms of growth? So giving both of those options in there, I think is a good thing to do. Understanding at the end of the day that it's an election process, but it's a tough balance. I'm listening to everyone around the table because there's also communities of interest. So I think the three options around the three wards that we've landed on is very indicative of the future. It allows for that future growth. I'm happy to do that. I agree with Sam's comments around 4.7b complicating the process, and it to me looks like a bit of a status quo to as a safe bet, because not much has changed by the look of it. There's still got 4 wards there, and the population hasn't changed a great deal in the Ellesmere ward, just looking at it like that. So I think if we're looking at change for what's best in the future, I think the 3 that you've decided on really do reflect that and continue along the lines of community interest.
Right. So you're proposing we don't bring forward 7B? 4.7b. Okay, John?
I believe that you would only include 4.7b because you wanted those that engage with you the opportunity to react and strike it out, which because it's so different from all the others, you will get people that sort of will focus on, but I don't believe it's a correct option for the district.
Okay, thank you. Graham?
The challenge for us as governors here is probably we're starting to talk a little bit on what's in it for me. We're starting to look at the numbers and go, we don't like this. But from a communities of interest thing, 4.7b has a lot of appeal about it, because you do retain those communities of interest you talk about, Mr. Chairman. So I think the danger for us is not to start thinking about what's in it for me. What does it mean for me? Is it one less spot for me? But is this the best thing for our community? So it's a challenging conversation, but it's there. It's the same that Stephen presented with the original 3 SE9. The argument there is it's either Dunsandel or West Melton, isn't it? Which is more linked to Melbourne than Ellesmere. Is it West Melton or is it Dunsandel? And so, 3 SE9 wasn't a bad model. So the challenge I'm facing, Mr. Chair, is I prefer that we actually stuck to the 4s first, got rid of the 4s, then get the 3s rather than flip-flopping back, because it's confusing and not necessarily conducive to good thinking.
So just so clear, you'd support taking 4.7b forward?
I guess, Mr. Chair, I'm asking what's the direction from the Chair about what your outcome you seek today. If you're seeking one option from 4, I would support 4.10c. If you're suggesting there's further work to be done, 4.7.10c and 4.7.10d, I think it was, sorry, that we had. So the drop Brixton in, and 4.7b meet the criteria that I would endorse.
Well, I was seeking 3 or 4 scenarios to take forward. I was supporting 4.7b as it gave the most different choice to our communities. It actually supports, as you've noted, it's the one that supports closest our current ward boundaries, and therefore some of the pre-consultation surveys suggest people like the status quo. Well, they can't have the status quo in terms of numbers and boundaries, but if we're to sort the status quo of wards as they currently stand, 4.7b supports the current wards. So that's, in my view, leaving it in there shows the greatest variety of choices for our community to choose from. I don't particularly think it's one that the community would choose because it's the most radical, but it's one that offers, in terms of community's interest, is the one that offers the status quo. It leaves pretty much everybody in the same ward they're in today. So, but that's my view, and as a member of the committee, there's the rest of us to offer our opinions. If it's not taken forward, it's not taken forward. But it would meet my desire in terms of it would give us 4 models to take forward.
Mr. Chair,
yes,
just to help the conversation, just to reiterate the process and timeline, we are obliged to go out to the community in September with an initial proposal, which is one option. So the proposal is that next month in July, we would go out for preliminary consultation, which can be more than one scenario that we take out to the community. So that's what we're, I guess, tending to get to today, to identify the number of options that we take out to the community for preliminary consultation. Then we will consider the views of the community following that consultation in July, and then go out to the community with our formal proposal in September. Just timeline and process.
Thank you. Given those comments, I think, yeah, I'd reluctantly agree that 47B will merely complicate that preliminary consultation, and that if we concentrated on the 2-3 ward models in 14D would be models to take forward. The other maps would be available to the community if they wished, in terms of there still could be feedback on the other 14 models. If there was an overwhelming, the community said, no, we prefer B, C, or E. Stephen?
The preference would be that we give a reasonably firm steer as to which the preferred options are. We would certainly be able to make all of the prior workings available. I think in the interest of transparency, we would have that available for people to see. They can easily be put up on the engagement website so that they're there, and the community can see what kind of options have been worked through to come to the position that we do go out for consultation.
Okay. Jenny, did you have any comment on those four? Would you support 47B or not support it? Well, that's a good comment, Mr. Ward.
I guess for me, the thing about 47B is it introduces potentially significant changes to the community's expectation of their elected members and the elected member workload by reducing it quite significantly. So what I would like to see the committee do is take forward some workable models, clearly articulating why the status quo can't continue through the 22 and 25 elections, and also make reference to the areas of perceived growth over that period of time, so that we can actually justify some of those changes for the first ones. But yeah, I can't see 47B probably going past the council table, I think.
Yeah. So if we take 47B out of there, does that meet with general agreement from the committee? John?
Well, I just listened to what Stephen said, and I'm not discounting what the chief executive said, but what he said is to put out, Stephen, 4 models or whatever it is, get a bit of feedback before we finalise our proposal to go to council for it to go out for consultation. So, having said what I said before, which is I'm now going to contradict, I can't see the problem with leaving in the map which has got 3. What is it? Take one away.
47B.
Yeah. So, if and nothing else, people react, oh no, I don't like that. That in itself would be good feedback. As for David's comment about workload, I don't see quite why the workload suddenly dramatically increased. Sure, you might have a few more people in your ward. You might have to get around a bit more. But and not allowed to talk about money, I know, but you are going to be rewarded quite significantly more, aren't you?
It's not that the number of people are going to change, it's that you will be running solo job. And you'll be. Okay. But the point I was making is that from a candidacy perspective, all of a sudden the commitment, the requirement, and recognition of the expectations on you as an elected member will change quite a wee bit.
I think that reflects the role of a councillor and where it's going from where it was to one that dealt with quite minor things to now taking a much more higher level policy directional type viewpoint. But
other members, we seem to have some discussion. I'm Sam.
Yeah, I think maybe taking it forward is it's not all bad, is it? like, I mean, I don't agree that it's probably going to be the one we're going to land on. I think it will overcomplicate things, but it'll also draw attention to the fact that the status quo isn't an option. If you want to keep the same ward boundaries, you have a dramatic decrease or change in councillors. And if you want to keep a similar number of councillors, then there's going to be some ward boundary change. So I don't believe it's going to be the one that we end up going through, but it might actually be part of the community understanding why the change is happening. And yeah, if members have wanted in there, I'm not going to try and vote against it to remove it. The reasons I said before, I think still stand, but I can understand why you might want it in there.
Okay. Any other comments? I mean, we can test. I guess we can test it by finding if we have a mover and seconder for the resolution that's before us. Would someone be to move what's there? And Shane will second it. Any further discussion? If not, I'll put that recommendation. Those in favour? Contrary? Carried. Thank you. That was a useful discussion. And now we move on to consideration of community board scenarios.
If I may make a comment as well, the maps you've seen to date is what I call a working map. They've got the mesh blocks in there. You can see the numbers of ratepayers involved. When we think about what we go out to the public with, if you look back at what went out last time, it was much less cluttered. There was the state highways were in there, the main highways, township names as well. So these maps here won't be the same when they go out to the community. They'll be much clearer from that sort of perspective.
Yeah, so again, we'll go through the scenarios around community boards. Just to, I guess, preface the report, we have come at this report from, I guess, the provisions of the legislation, which are primarily around effective representation in communities of interest, and so the Act gives the council the ability to bring community boards into play in order to meet those objectives. And so what we've tried to set out here is a range of workable options that could be considered under the scenarios that we're looking at the moment for the ward boundaries. So I'm happy to let Murray take you through those scenarios.
Thank you. So as Stephen's saying, what we're thinking about is the communities of interest. And so we know from the research that the communities of interest identified as townships. So now we've got to the point of identifying what are the sort of the overall governance models that you're looking at. Will they be enhanced or improved through community boards? Are the communities of interest well represented by your current models, or should you then break it down and say, actually, we do need to have another layer as a community board? The way to think about it too is, particularly in relation to the 3 ward scenarios, is that you could get elected members elected from one edge of your ward. You don't know where they're going to come from as part of that. If that was to occur, would that mean that the other communities of interest were not well represented, or were they represented by someone that did not know their issues and could work with that? So the concept of thinking about the community boards is thinking, well, if you had a community board that was in a large ward that was subdivided as you currently have, would that allow for those communities of interest to be represented in a better way than if you did not have them? And that's sort of really that sort of way of thinking about it and looking at that. So when you look at your 4.7b, for example, you've reduced the numbers of councillors down. Is that sufficient to represent those communities of interest? And a way of thinking about that could be to say the 7 councillors work on a more strategic level, and you have your community board with different delegations and local decision making actually working at that next level down. That's one way of thinking about that side of it. And with the 3 ward scenarios, it comes back to really, are they too large for the individuals to represent again those communities of interest? And that's sort of the approach that the report is gone through. When we look at the option of Melbourne with West Melton in there, that West Melton is quite a large area, so it effectively is another community of interest. And what we're looking at there is saying, realistically, you're going to be looking at subdivision of 3 around that side of it, because again, you've got the existing communities that are working well in the sense of the numbers of plus or minus 10%. You've got to somehow incorporate another large amount in there. And so we've, looking at that, we've actually kept your existing boundaries fairly similar with that subdivision. But then we've also brought a third subdivision through into that West Melton one. So that's sort of the overview of what we're sort of looking at around these options. So we've given the option there, obviously, of no community board. If you think about scenario 1, which is we call the 410B in the report, but effectively it works the same as the 410C, D or E. It's the same scenario that we have to make numbers work. So whatever option does turn up, it can be just adjusted around the edges because it's only minor changes there. So in that scenario there, we've looked at just the 1 community board, which is that status quo, but it does require an additional subdivision really to make it work effectively on that side of it. Do you want me to look at just go through each scenario and stop, or just carry on through them? What would you prefer? Okay, yeah. Thank you. With the 3 wards, we've looked there, 47B, we looked again at the no community board, but came up with the 4 community boards, as I was saying earlier. And again, that's sort of that approach of that strategic approach and decision making at the lower level via a community board. Then obviously we look at the 3 wards. It pretty much is that view of how can you represent your community? Are they well represented by the elected members that you have at the time? And certainly conscious that from the research, people putting views forward that they do approach the council direct as well. They don't always need to go to a council meeting, whether it be a council meeting or community board meeting, to get their views across now. So the world has shifted and changed as well. So are their views as a community of interest well represented as a ward, or should it be subdivided? I could probably talk too long on it, so I won't do that. But what it's trying to do is say, when you think about the overall options we've come up with, the 410Ds and the 3s, are they enhanced by the inclusion of a community board, or are they sufficient on their own? And it's getting out there to the community with that pre-consultation to understand how the community sees that.
Committee comments. In the lieu of everybody else rushing to push them out, for me, in the 47B, looks like it would work best with 4 community boards. With a reduced number of councillors and community board each ward, the incoming council might be inclined to give stronger delegations to those ward committees and actually give them some work to do, which might make the process work well. You know, in a generous scenario, one might assume that the councillors could focus on strategy and policy, and the community boards could oversee budgets, footpaths, and potholes, and that there would be work for all to do. I think 47B with no community boards may well struggle to be excuse me, for our community to see that as good representation. For the other models, it's hard to see in the 3 ward models that an argument to continue a Malvern community board wouldn't also apply to the enlarged Springs Ellesmere area, in terms of you're talking about geographical representation and communities of interest. So personally, I think I would lean to either 2 or 0 for the 3 ward models, and in the 4 ward model, probably 0, because I'm not sure that there is the support in the current Malvern ward for the Malvern Community Board that existed 6 years ago or 12 years ago. Council has previously recommended to disestablish community boards. Those boards have gone out into the community and sought the community support, have appealed the decision and won. 6 years ago, the Selwyn Central Community Board appealed, did not have significant community support, and did not succeed. So there is an argument that if we propose to disestablish the Malvern Community Board, it would force the board to demonstrate either in the pre-consultation or in the final model that they do have the community support to continue. And if they do, well and good. If they don't, well and good. So, David.
When this discussion goes back to council, Mr. Chair, the things that council will have to give consideration to if they support community boards are, firstly, what is the role of the community board or boards? Secondly, what delegations is council prepared to give to the boards? And thirdly, an understanding of the cost, because the boards would be funded through a targeted rates. Just to give you an idea, the Melbourne Community Board is $44, $46, I think it is, per rateable property, and that would be a reasonably similar sum that would be expected across all rateable properties where a community board was actually supported.
Mr. Chief, would it be assuming that there'd be no discretionary funds?
That would be correct, Mr. Board Chair, yes.
I guess what we're wanting to do is hear from the community around whether or not they want a community board. And 3 years or 6 years ago, we went through that process and heard, as you've outlined, pretty clearly from 2 different communities. And I think the best way for the community to give us that feedback is through us saying, there's no community board. If you want one, tell us. And that way we can go through the process and put one in if they ask us for it. And if we do that early through the pre-consultation, that starts the process early. And if we leave it, then it becomes harder and harder for the community to have that. So I think if we go out and say, yes, it should definitely be there, it doesn't allow the community the same level of input into the discussion. It's pre-consultation, it's not the answer, it's not council's position, it's saying, tell us what you think, and then we'll make a decision when we go with the final option in September.
So Sam, by that, do you mean approaching, if we go for 47B, all awards to see if they want community boards or just Melbourne?
Yeah, well, it's an answer to the whole community. That's a question to the whole community. It'll be interesting to see what those other 3 wards that currently don't have community boards feedback to us. I think the strongest views are going to come out of Melbourne, and because they have recent experience with the current community board. So I would expect there to be some strong support for the community board to come out of there. Equally, there may be some voices that say we don't need it. So let's hear that rather than us make a decision today. This isn't final. This is saying how do we want to approach the community for this discussion.
I've just got one more question. How long ago is it since the other wards, I mean, I know Selwyn Central, but Ellesmere and Springs, since they had community boards, so it's quite some time, isn't it? Grant, you might be able to answer that.
Throw me a hand grenade, why don't you? Up until now, I think it's been seen largely that Springs and Ellesmere didn't quite one. Geographically, Springs was quite tight. Let's be brutally honest, the Springs Selwyn Central one was disestablished because it was felt that it wasn't required, because there was a very high geographic concentration of councillors who were doing the equivalent job.
Yeah.
I think what I'm interested in is today's council meeting. There's a recommendation around community committees, what they might look like in the future. One of those is potentially an 8-committee, super committee structure. So you might have a community board in name, but they're volunteers. And so you might have a Melbourne Community Committee. So is there still the desire to have a fully all singing, all dancing community board, or is it better to have a community committee, which is suggested in today's agenda, which may take some of that drive away? Just remembering that if the outcome of the current community committee rationalisation takes place, a large portion of the Melbourne Community Board's work attending reserve and community committee meetings will be gone because those committees will not longer exist. So what is the work we're going to give that committee? Is it meaningful? Is there enough work to sustain it? And But again, like the Mayor says, well, at the end of the day, it's for Melbourne people to decide because it's the representation that they choose.
Yeah.
But it seems at the moment that it's probably verging on the stage of has it got a viable future? And I don't know that because I don't live there, and I wouldn't be willing to put my hand up and say cut its throat when the locals get to choose themselves.
Sure. Oh yeah, kia ora, Mr. Chair. Well, I think Sam's option is good to go back to the community and find out what they want first. I still think we need to give them some options, and the options need to align with what we've clearly decided on today to go back with in the 3-ward option. Thanks very much, Grant, for the conversation around community committees, because we seem to be, we need to be doing the consultation, if not together, at least letting our communities know the direction so that they can form and give their opinion back to us. The structures that we've put forward today will increase the geographical area of the council's responsibility. So taking that in mind, I think the option to come together as community boards will lend itself well to discussion around community committees and how the future of those committees, or how they see themselves. So leads well into that discussion, and also centralises a lot of the conversation into a central point. And maybe John would probably be to the benefit of that, to create, to allow for councillors to receive information, clear information, and the direction of their ward. Stages that can be conversational, where we really need the hard facts to go back away and perform our duties. Also, I do see the benefit in community boards and really should align. So I think the one that stood out for me was really the 4. There might be that one up there. 4. No, it's not 4.7b. I think it is. Yeah, and I think we do need to go with some options, because we've seen in terms of the committee review, there's some lack of understanding at the moment of what options we are giving, and that's creating a whole lot of confusion, a lot of talk. So yeah, I'll
To answer
that one forward. Thank you.
To answer your question, Grant, the difference between a ward committee and a community board is the statutory support and definition for their role. A ward committee is by nature a committee of council, and therefore is restricted on what it can submit on and what it can choose to investigate. A community board is not a creature of council. A community board is independent and can choose to submit on whatever it chooses, as long as it is relevant to its rohi. As a community board member, we submitted on plan changes, annual plans, long-term plans, and as far as even submitting on select committee on RMA reform. A ward committee would struggle to do any of those. Possibly council could give it a delegation with submitting on annual plans and long-term plans, but the rest, council's been loath to delegate the ability to submit to ward or township committees. So community boards have that degree of independence, and they can make the role anything they choose to make the role, as long as it's relevant to their community or communities. So that's the difference, that ward committees are more hamstrung by council than even a community board is. A community board can choose a lot, to do a lot more if it wishes than a ward committee can, and council cannot rein it in as much. So in terms of effective representation for the community, a community board is actually better, in my view, than a ward committee, because it can do more. It can hold council to task better than a ward committee. So, as I say, I think that, it may be that we say in 4.7b, let's propose 4 community boards, because I think it makes sense as a structure in that scenario. But perhaps in the other scenarios, we propose no community boards. Again, it gives a range of models for our community to consider going forward.
Yeah, just
Go John first.
Yeah, that's fine.
Acknowledging previous speakers, which I don't disagree with. Now, just correct me, we have a meeting of this group on the 23rd of June. I wondered whether this group would have what decisions made this afternoon related to community committees would have any impact on our decision making. I don't have to give an answer to that, I just posed that question in there. I agree with what the chairman's just said, that if council was to select for 7B, I beg your pardon, if the decision was to be finalised at 4.7B, you would have some momentum around community boards, not necessarily on all boards. But if you go to the other options of the 4.10B, I think you have less momentum or less argument around the retention of community boards. But I'm going to be watching, as others, as to what council decides this afternoon, because I think that has an impact on the need or the not need of a community board. Now, history has shown us that none of the other wards, well, Springs and Ellesmere, have ever wanted a community board. And I don't think that it would be difficult for them to suddenly change their mind. The removal or the discontinuation of the community board or area board in Rolleston was really necessitated because there were 4 elected councillors in a very small area and were able to easily get around. So having been to the commission twice with the future of the community board and twice been successful, the predominant argument that we used there each time was a number of committees to serve, distance between those committees and the travel and the time was one of the main arguments that we put up to the commission, and they accepted that. But council, or this council, has never really, I was going to use the word endorsed, but I don't think it's quite the word, would have never really empowered or incorporated the community board into part of its proper governance functioning. And so I believe over the latter years, whether that was the fault of the members, and it could well be, whether it was the fault of the council or whether it fell to the board, community board has been less beneficial to the community than it was in the early days. Now, and so with 2 councillors and some creativity and some commitment by council around some regular representation to that community in around those bigger committees, I think you can probably achieve the same outcome.
Yeah, I circulated some stuff around community boards across the country that was presented to the last National Council meeting for LGNZ, which showed that there's not really any consistent rhyme or reason. And sorry, I meant to send it to you, Murray. There's no consistent rhyme or reason as to why community board exists anywhere. The only reason they're there is for historical reasons, and it tends to be because of decisions made in 1989 and people wanting to keep elected members as local as they could to their ward when they felt they were getting consumed by a larger area. Since 1989, there's been a lot of change with usually community boards being disestablished rather than new ones coming in. But when the Remuneration Authority was trying to come up with a consistent way to apply funding to the boards, they were unable to see any logic to be able to apply things consistently. So we know around the country there's different reasons why community boards exist, and I think for us we need to, as John's articulated, focus on why has it existed here and what are the reasons why it is here, and does the community want it to continue, and that is granted several in some way be determined by what we decide this afternoon. I like that the community board is separate than council. I think that there's strength, there's autonomy, there's the ability to act according to your own wishes as a community board, in the same way that there is for an incorporated society that we don't have when you're a committee of council. So if we're to think about future committees of council, I'm more cautious of that. I'd rather support our committees of council to become incorporated societies and think about the freedom that they're able to receive within that. We do need to continue to support local. Anyone living in a large geographic area to feel like that their own views are being heard. And if we're going to go to the 4.7b model, then having some dialogue, particularly the pre-consultation, around how this could look around 4 community boards would then engage the 3 wards that don't currently have community boards in that discussion. Whereas if we don't say we're thinking about having community boards somewhere, those 3 wards are probably going to stay reasonably silent because they don't have one, and we'll just assume that they're not going to get one. The subdivision within the ward I think is interesting too, and I just wonder whether we should think about how that is broken up. It's currently sort of east-west and a Darfield Kui together, and everyone else lumped in the one place, and it doesn't feel to me like the true division between the way people travel, the way people connect, which is far more of an east-west divide rather than a north-west divide, and to have Windwhistle and Springfield in the same subdivision doesn't seem to me to be the right way to actually divide Melbourne up at the moment with the current ward boundary. And if we're starting to think about whatever the future ward boundary is going to look like, I think we should also look at the subdivision within that ward, and that may be a separate discussion. I don't know if that's part of this pre-consultation piece, that we have to go with what the subdivisions look like, but I know that we've tried to stay status quo as much as we can, and I'm not hearing lots of people in the community asking for us to change it, but the line to me doesn't seem the most natural line around communities of interest in Melbourne. Thanks.
I just wanted to raise a few points, I guess. First of all, I suppose from the councillor perspective, our population per councillor is relatively low. So you look at some other, particularly Christchurch and those who do have community boards, but they have 50,000 per councillor. So really, probably honestly, we're overrepresented on a population basis. So geographically, perhaps not, but on a population basis now. We're sort of skirting around the issue because we don't want to be blunt, and I'm going to grab it by the nettles, I suppose, is that nowhere in here is there an actual review or representation of the effectiveness of this organisation. I'm talking about the community board. And you have to be blunt because that's the place we're in. Because if you're going to carry on supporting an organisation, you have to say, well, has it been effective over the last 3, 6, 9 years? What has it delivered to this organisation? What has it delivered to the community? And has it been effective? And from the outside, or from my perspective, I'm not seeing huge benefits to this organisation. That's only from this side. But has it provided benefits to the community up there? And that's the thing that perhaps we're not aware of, and we need to understand that. But it's a typical human condition that no matter what you have, if someone takes it away, you feel you've lost something. Whether it's obsolete or not, and you have it sitting in the corner of your room, someone takes it away, you feel you've lost something. So it's going to fall on Stephen, as always. The communication is critical. In all these scenarios, as described, we're setting a what, but the community wants to know the how. What does this look like? So in action, if we went to this scenario, how would this actually work, and what would it mean for me? And so that's what our community is asking us to do today. They're asking us to provide options, but not just options. How would it actually work? What would it look like? If we didn't have the Melbourne Community Board or a Selwyn Central or a Springs Community Board, what would that mean for me as a ratepayer? How would I get access to a councillor or the council? What would it look like? Is it digital? Is it by having coffee drop-in sessions? What does it mean? And I don't think we've grasped that level either and that's probably a development of where we are now, I guess. But, is it part of our work stream? I think probably, to be honest, we need to get out of a little hut here and go and have a meeting in Darfield or somewhere and actually ask the community to come and talk to us. And that's why I asked the chairman about the briefing. I thought that may have been an opportunity. Admittedly, you're probably going to get more people supporting because people will get out of their houses when they feel they're going to lose something. People don't get out of their houses to say, cut it, so you've got to take that into account. But it's beholden on us to get up there and listen to the ratepayers as well. But I'd like to see a report of the effectiveness of that organisation over the last, I think probably one term's not enough, probably 2 to 3 terms. So we can judge it by some meaningful way. If we are to make a recommendation, what are we basing it on? Is there some data, or is there some feedback from the community? What is it we're basing it on? So at the moment, it's pretty much just personal opinion, which I don't really want us to get into that scene.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to come back and repeat some comments I made before. I think that we're a couple of steps short of being able to give consideration to whether we want community boards or not. We need to clearly understand what those community boards would do. So I think if we're going to pass any recommendation today, or recommendations, they would be twofold. The first one is a staff report outlining what delegations council may wish to consider handing to community boards, and bear in mind that we've got that delegation model for Melbourne Community Board at the moment. So that council needs to be comfortable, and it comes back really to the points that John was raising. As an elected member, what are you going to do? What are your expectations within the community? And the second one would be to prepare a draft operating budget for the community board, because, as I said, the cost is generally around 40 or the mid-40s in terms of dollars for each community, and that will dictate, I think, the outcome for a lot of people involved in the consultation process. And both of those things could be done for the meeting on the 23rd.
That's the case, given the discussion I've heard, particularly what Councillor Miller's just said, would we be better off removing clause B from the recommendation and simply not make a decision about community boards today, noting that we will have to make a decision on the 28th, and ask for those reports for the 28th in order to make that decision? How do members feel? Is that the feeling I'm getting from the meeting? And I guess I can test that by asking members to move, someone to move the recommendation as their A, C and D as it currently stands.
I'll second it.
Is there any further discussion on that?
Yeah, can I?
Councillor Gallagher?
Can I just ask a question, please, of the community board? Have the individual members of the board been asked how they feel going forward, what their choice would be? Yeah.
At the last meeting, there was a request to make for members to give a view, and they were very cagey.
So they did not express a view as a board?
No, they played a pure political line and didn't quite commit themselves. That was my impression. I think one member might have definitely said he is, Ken, but others were a little bit cagier.
Sam?
I'm just, I'm happy to vote on this, but I'm just wondering whether there needs, so long as staff are aware of the conversation that we have and the type of questions or the way that we're going to frame the pre-consultation stuff, I'd love to see that next time so that we can actually have a proper discussion around what that will look like when it goes out around community boards, and how we're going to frame up the question. I think will matter to the type of engagement that we're going to see from our community.
Yeah.
I wonder, Mr. Chair, also if you've drawn history, but you're not restricted by history, by council twice before, by deciding not to continue with the community board, followed the scenario of what Councillor Miller just identified. When you thought you were going to lose something, you reacted, and basically it was reinstated because that was a change, and that pretty much what happened the last two times that we went to the commission.
2 out of 3. The Central Board lost 12 years ago. Both boards were proposed to be disestablished.
That's right, yeah.
And it was appealed, both were re-established or continued with. 6 years ago, Council's proposal was to continue with the Melbourne Board and disestablish Central. Central appealed and lost. Stephen, you had.
Yeah, it was just to pick up a couple of comments and also, again, just talk about the process. In terms of the preliminary consultation, it would definitely have been our recommendation that the consultation would include public meetings in the relevant areas, so the opportunity for people to come along and discuss with members of the committee that would be able to attend those. The other opportunity that we have in the preliminary consultation is that we could attach an option to each of the scenarios that we go out with a community board or without a community board. So it could actually be an option. So for 14D, for example, it could be a with community board and without community board option. So we could ask for the community's feedback on whether they saw the community board as an option under each of the scenarios, or any or all of the scenarios that we do go out with as part of that process.
Okay. So just looking at the resolution in front of us, Stephen, it's workable for us today to leave the issue of community boards open. We're able to prepare a report or reports for the next meeting in terms of the other scenarios for the pre-consultation, knowing that we've yet to finalise the community board option.
We can do, just noting that on the meeting on the 23rd, I think it is, we do need to have the community's final call on which options we are going out for consultation on. So I would be expecting that we would be coming back with something fairly close to a draft of the preliminary consultation material. And at this stage, we can perhaps include the options for community boards in or out and make that call at the next meeting.
Thank you. Any further discussion on the resolution in front of us? If not, those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, carried. I think that completes our work for the day. Thank you, members, for your participation. And I think we had a good debate today, and I really appreciate that. Thank you.